Welcome to this I presentation on ESXi Hypervisor installation. In this module, we'll discuss the different installation methods that we have to get our ESXi deploy over to our host. We have three methods of doing that. We could either do an interactive installation, where we manually sit there and answer all our questions, run through the installer till we get to the end. The second one would be our scripted or unattended installation. That's our second method. And the third one would be the automated or the auto deploy installation method. So let's get right into the interactive installation type. So this is basically recommended for small deployments, and it is the simplest of the three installation types. Firstly, we'll set our server boot order in the BIOS or on your boot menu. You'll set that to boot from your media, so be it your CD, DVD, USB, or if you're PXI booting over the network, you would configure that. Let's just bear in mind too, if you're running your hypervisor or your ESXi on top of another hypervisor, like we'll be doing here, what you could do is also mount an ISO file with your ESXi installation to a virtual drive and get that up and running. So basically, after the installation or your setup has booted there, you would accept your licensing agreement and then choose your boot device or your installation partition where you would want that to go to, and just go through the installation. At the end of that, you would be at your DCUI or your direct console user interface. This is where you'll configure your management IP and some other settings, but we'll get to that in a separate video. But once your installation completes and it gets to the end here, it would auto pull an IP address from DHCP, providing that you have that in your infrastructure, and that's the IP address that you'll use to connect your vSphere client to manage that ESXi host. Okay. Let's talk a bit about our second installation method. So this is the scripted or unattended installation method. This method of installation speeds up on the installation process, as well as it provides a consistent installation and basic configuration for our ESXi host. So with a scripted or an installation script or a kickstart file, this is used to automate much of the tasks that we did with the interactive installation. This will contain information like accepting your end user license agreement, partition that you'll need to boot to, be it on your your partition you need to boot to, your keyboard layout, or your network configurations for management. So after the creation of this script, you could place it on a USB device. So at boot time, your installer could feed from this. We would then edit the boot menu at startup and point the installation really to this installation script. Our third method, our third method of installation is the automated or your auto deploy installation. This would allow the host to receive a full copy of your ESXi with configuration over the network. In this case, you don't need this on your actual host where you'll be installing to, because the installer will come over the network and load directly onto memory on your host. Let's just bear in mind though, for this to happen, we would need a vCenter server already in place. I have another slide with the prerequisites for this, so we'll get to that in a little bit. So basically, you boot from over the network, pull an image into your memory, and that image comes from, or an image profile that comes from your auto deploy server. And then you could have your host profiles with configuration applied to that host too. So let's talk a little bit about the auto deploy modes. We have three modes where you could do the auto deploy: the stateless installation, the stateless caching, and the stateful installation. So with stateless installation, This is where a copy of the ESXi is loaded from the auto deploy server onto the host memory as it boots. Stateless caching. This is where a copy is stored locally of the installer. So it does this to store a copy locally just in case your auto deploy server is not available. So basically a copy of ESXi is cached onto the local storage or on the SAN LAN that you boot from, or from what this host would boot from. So the booting of an image from the auto deploy server will take priority. But if it's not available, then the local copy would be used. And as I mentioned, that would be either from your SAN boot partition or your SAN LAN or on a local storage. And the last one, stateful installation, this is actually the reverse of stateless caching. So it's very similar to stateless caching except the boot order is reversed. So it tries to boot from the local disk first, then network after. So it's not automatic though. This boot order would not change if it's set to boot from your local disk. That's how it's going to be. It won't automatically change unless you specifically told it to boot again from the auto deploy server. Okay, so let's go on to another slide here. Okay, so I have another slide here with the requirements for auto deploy. As I mentioned, you would need a vCenter server already deployed in your infrastructure and with the auto deploy service enabled. Let's just bear in mind with vSphere 6.0, both the vCenter server appliance and the Windows-based installation, you don't need to install the auto deploy server as a separate service. It's already installed on the vCenter server. You just need to enable it. Actually, we'll just take a look at one of the infrastructure I have up here. We're not trying to get ahead of ourselves, but I just want you guys to have an idea where at least you could enable this service. So we'll get to that in a little bit. Also, as I mentioned, we need auto deploy server with the service enabled, and this would be on our vCenter server. Secondly, we would need a DHCP server. So at boot time, the DHCP would assign an IP address to the host, along with the IP address also of your TFTP server. We would configure DHCP options 66 and 67. This is basically to point the host to our TFTP server. So TFTP server now. We need that. Well, the TFTP server contains basically the boot and config file that points the host to the auto deploy server. The host would then make a boot request to the auto deploy server. And image profiles. So an image profile is basically a bunch of ESXi software packages, and these are called vSphere installation bundle or VIB files. Based on the information that the host presents to the auto deploy server, the correct image profile would be downloaded to the host via HTTP. Let me just show you guys a demonstration here of the vSphere environment that I have, and then we'll come back to this. Actually, let's cover this here. So for installation, we have three options. Once we are booting, if our ESXi installation finds another data store or in our installation there, what it would do is we have three options. What it would do there. So it would either upgrade the ESXi from, if it was a previous version, you had 5.5, now you're trying to do 6 onto that host. It would either upgrade the host and preserve the VMFS data store. It will install ESXi rather than upgrade and preserve the data store, or it would install ESXi and override the current data store. But we'll talk about VMFS and data store and those things in our storage section. So let me just demonstrate this, the auto deploy setting. As I said, I don't want us to get too ahead of ourselves here. I just want you guys to have a look at this environment and take a look where you would find the auto deploy settings. Okay, so we are at our home screen here. So on the home, it's divided into inventories, monitoring, and administration. But I have a separate slide where I describe the interface for this. But for now, we'll come under system config. While it's under system config, if you come under services here, you see the first one on the list, auto deploy. So by default, this is disabled. So we'll come into our startup type. You might want to set it to automatically boot with your ESXi host. So once we have that configured here, we'll come back here, right click, and then start our service. It's very similar to how you would do with services in Windows. So once we get that out of the way, we'll come in our inventory. We'll come into our inventory list here. If we come down to our vCenter server, click on the actual vCenter server. You notice we have under manage. So vCenter server, then come under manage, settings, and then we have a couple of settings here. One of them is auto deploy. Okay, so you have some basic info about it here. These are the boot files we were talking about. You could download them here. Also, you could download your logs here for auto deploy.